I'm Neil Doherty with North Country Whitetails, and welcome to DSI. You know, for years you've been reading about big bucks and some of the stories behind how they're harvested, but you never really got a full picture. In DSI, we're going to break it down in great detail and really give you the behind-the-scenes talk and understanding why deer do what they do. We're going to merge the deer stories with the science behind how the deer move, the food sources in the area, get up above and study aerial photography, and really teach you how to use those techniques when it comes to your hunts this fall. This is the story of the cardiac buck. First off, we need to get to know this farm a little bit. It's a large farm. It's about 1,200 acres that had been under management for the last 5 years, managing for mature deer. There's 3 main food complexes on the farm, and they're primarily planted in a mixture of standing corn that's left all year round, beans, and also brassica and clover. The timber is made up of a northeastern type forest. There's a scattering of oak trees, ash trees, maple trees, and some hemlock for thermal cover. So there's good food in the woods, and the open grassland fields are starting to regenerate in forbs and other plants that wildlife can use, especially deer. So there's a tremendous amount of food on this particular piece of property. Now the cardiac story starts with the landowner looking through his camera photos in his initial deer survey. And as he's going through his photos and capturing a few kind of nondescript small bucks, all of a sudden, wham, this monster buck shows up, staring him just blank in the face in a close encounter. And he called it cardiac because he said he nearly had a heart attack and dropped out of his chair when he saw the picture of the deer. So at that point, he started to work on a patterning mission to try to determine how he was going to intercept cardiac during the first part of the season, still about 45 days away. He blanketed the food plot that cardiac was using with cameras, and once a week would slip in when the winds were right, just a low pressure slip in, pull the film, and try to determine what the buck was up to. And from triangulating the cameras, he decided that more than likely the buck was using the sanctuary that was located off to the eastern side of the main field as a bedding location. He was drifting out of the sanctuary to the north into the food plot, or he was coming out of the north drifting in a southerly direction as he headed to the food plot. So the stage was set for this buck to try to intercept him once the season started. The beginning of the season was every day just seemed to be the wind blowing out of the west. And a westerly wind would take any of the hunter's scent to try to hunt on the path where cardiac was using, would drift the hunter's scent right down in the sanctuary or potentially where cardiac was coming from. So there was no opportunity to get in between cardiac and the sanctuary during the first part of the season. So the hunter actually stayed away from cardiac at this time of the year. The other thing that was really quite unique for this is the neighboring property line was very close to where cardiac was bedding. And these guys hunted hard. So you have a tremendous deer, you have a buck that's in the sanctuary using the food plots, and you have a hunter that knows he's there that actually didn't hunt this deer for the first 2 weeks of the season because the winds weren't right and he was afraid of boogering up the deer. And that actually played into the overall strategy for the season-long chess match the hunter had with cardiac. As the season progressed, the buck turned nocturnal. And biologically speaking, when a deer finishes gaining his body weight, which usually happens around October 15th, the buck's need for feed will drop and will start to slow down their use of these large destination fields, oftentimes turning to nocturnal animals until the rut kicks in. So the next series of photos of cardiac showed him after dark, and there's really no need to try to intercept him on hunting at that point because he just wasn't killable. And as the rut started to pick up in November, he just blew up and went crazy. So he left the corner of the farm where he had been all late summer and early fall, and he was skipping around the farm, various places during daylight hours, at night. They were seeing him for tree stands, and he was just chasing does like mad. He was extremely visible, but very difficult to try to pick off during the rut. There was a couple close encounters, but as oftentimes with good deer, if they're covering a lot of ground, it's just hard to pin them down for that successful kill. Once the rut started to wrap up, cardiac again went nocturnal. And he wasn't showing up on the food sources during daylight time. Really at this point, he's getting ready to become vulnerable, because what happens during the last part of hunting season, and it's typically, especially with a rutting buck like cardiac, He's worn his body out to the point where he's going to be vulnerable. He needs to feed to repair the body when cold weather sets in. So the hunter very patiently just sat back and observed and watched his cameras until he had the first indication during cold weather that cardiac was starting to use one of the food sources. In this case, it was a central destination feeding field, and it was time to pounce and attack. There were several stand locations around this particular food plot. On the particular day that Dave was able to encounter cardiac, there was a light northwesterly wind blowing through. It was expected to go dead calm by the time darkness rolled around, just about the time cardiac was going to drift out into the food plot. His approach into the stand was in a deep irrigation ditch that covered up his activity of moving in, so he's hidden from deer that could have been laying along the edge of the hedgerow. Slipped up in the stand early, even though his scent was drifting in the direction where cardiac was expected to walk out, betting on the fact that when the air temperature or the wind stopped, the air temperature would cool and the thermals would start to kick in, changing his scent. And that's exactly what happened. About 45 minutes before dark, the wind stopped. It got colder. It was down to about 10 degrees. The wind stopped drifting from the north. It turned around and started now to pool as it moved away from the deer's approach. And it actually worked out perfectly because cardiac moved up through. He came a little bit closer on his path into the stand than was expected and showed up for a 60-yard shot on his way into the carbohydrate food source. You know, the takeaway here when you're dealing with a good deer on a piece of property is the hunting season can be a long chess match. If a deer is not killable because he's nocturnal or the wind direction isn't right, and that's just the way it was for cardiac the first part of the season, stay away from him and leave him alone. Don't push him and don't pressure him because he'll go nocturnal knowing he's being hunted and you'll never see him again, or worse yet, the neighbors will get him because you've pushed him out of bounds. So stay off him and leave him alone until he starts to show you that he's ready to be hunted. Either he's moving during daylight hours or even wait for the entire season to progress where he has to repair his body like Dave did on the late season food source.